Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Teena. India is at a critical juncture in its development journey, aiming to transform itself into a developed entity by 2047, the centenary of its independence. Shaping this vision requires diverse facets of development such as economic prosperity, social advancement, environmental sustainability and most of all, effective governance. In his Independence Day speech this year, Prime Minister Narendra Modi reaffirmed his government's commitment to propel India on a trajectory towards realizing this goal and on the way also meeting several other targets we've set for ourselves. From the ramparts of the Red Fort, the Prime Minister once again urged policymakers, economists, industrialists, entrepreneurs, citizens, members of the civil society and every other stakeholder in this development journey to work as a collective towards achieving this milestone. So the groundwork has been done over the past decade by way of transformative policies across sectors and a growth-oriented roadmap. The need now is for a quantum leap towards a holistic and inclusive growth. The question is, how prepared are we for the concrete action, meticulous planning and sustained efforts required in this transformative journey? How should India step up its game in the coming years to seize the opportunity and move forward with our dreams and resolutions? Well, answers to these questions have been laid out in detail by Mr. Karthik Muralidharan, the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego, in his highly acclaimed book, Accelerating India's Development, a State-Led Roadmap for Effective Governance. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome Mr. Muralidharan on this podcast on Sansad TV to talk to us about the key message of his book, the state of transformation we are in currently, the challenges that we face in our growth and also how we can tackle them in time to realize our ambitious goal of becoming a Viksit Bharat by 2047. Thank you, Mr. Muralidharan, for your time. Welcome to Sansad TV.
Thank you, Teena. It's my pleasure to be here.
First of all, congratulations to you on this great piece of work and the kind of response that it has garnered. Let me begin by asking you about the motivation, the core motivation behind this book that you've written, Accelerating India's Development. Was there or is there a personal experience that has inspired this book?
Thank you, Teena. I think the honest answer is, see, I'm an economics professor and I got motivated to study economics because I turned 16 in 1991 and saw the power of economic liberalization in terms of unlocking India's potential and have always been fascinated by economics since then. And I have been a public finance economist and most of my research has focused on the effectiveness of public spending and public policies in education, in health, in a whole variety of areas. Now, what happens is normally academic economics professors, we do most of our research in individual research papers that is written for other academics. But after 25 years of this research, I felt that there was enough knowledge that had been accumulated that it made sense to invest in a book that is aimed at the non-technical public. So this is written in a way that any college student in any subject or even a motivated 11th or 12th standard student should be able to read and understand. But at the same time, it is based on an enormous amount of research. So it looks like 800 pages, but it's only 600 pages because 200 pages are notes and references, right? So there is enough here for a high school student. If you want to go deeper, there's enough for a college student, for a master's student and a PhD student. So it's written in a way that you can read it at different levels of rigor. And, I think my motivation in writing all of this is that I think there is one part of the writing which is for policymakers, but the deeper reason for writing is for citizens, is for students, because they are the future, they are the next generation. And so, sometimes it is the Rohini Nilakani, had this very nice quote that says, experts often think that they're distributing solutions, but the real impact comes from distributing agency, So my 5-year journey of writing this book kind of started at the place of saying, I have done a lot of research, I want to share solutions. But I think the long-term goal of the book now is really to empower millions of youngsters and students and youth to read and understand how governance works so that each of them can then become change agents in their own way.
For those who have read this book, have described it as a magnum opus. For those who haven't, who are yet to get a copy of this 800-page volume, what would your message to them be about? What's the core theme? Why should they read the book?
So it's a great question, and I think, see, one simple way to give the core idea of the book is that most of our development challenges and discourses, whether it's education or health, we tend to talk at the sectoral level, right? But the common cross-cutting challenge we face is really issues of governance, issues of effectiveness of the government. So one way I like to describe the core thesis is, pre-liberalization, right? The Indian economy, one of the metaphors of the Indian economy was like a 1950s ambassador car, because for 30 years that car did not change till we did liberalization. So in some ways you can think about the Indian state itself a bit like a 1950s ambassador car, and that's because as we have more and more aspirations, right? We add a lot more expectations on the state, but we have not reinvested enough in the state in terms of delivering. So I would say there are two core points in the book. One is that governance is kind of a cross-cutting challenge that will affect every goal, every development goal. So, and that is something we need to pay systematic attention to. And then related to that, of course, is how to do that, which is why, there's a bunch of depth in the book. But the other very important message is that this is perhaps the first major policy book in India that is focused on actions at the state government level, okay? And that recognizes the fact that most of our policy discourse and dialogue focuses on Delhi, but the majority of topics that affect the lives of citizens in terms of service delivery, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's police, whether it's land laws, labor laws, and even centrally designed schemes are all implemented at the state level. So the state is a unit that really needs a lot more attention. And so I think intellectually that's another key distinction in the book. But the last thing I'll say for your readers, or listeners who get scared at the idea of an 800-page book is that I'll say a few things. One, it's only 600 pages. Second, to write these 600 pages, it's like I have read 60,000 pages. So when people ask for summaries, it's like you're getting a very concise summary, of a much vaster literature. So one way to think about this is that each 30-page chapter can be read on its own, and that's almost like a mini book, right? So each chapter has enough content to be a full book and represents research that I've synthesized. So just if you pick it up and just read one chapter a day, you can easily read it in half an hour, 45 minutes, and then it'll be a very, very easy flowing read. So that's the last thing, which is like you yourself noticed, is that where so much of the effort goes is, see, as professors, we are used to communicating very technically, right? But where most of the effort goes is, I remember a former editor at Mint, he said that the goal is to write in a way that a high school student can understand, but in a way that the greatest expert in the world should not find anything wrong. So, and that is the challenge, right? Which is to simplify the writing without simplifying the ideas, so that you can communicate deep ideas, but in a very accessible way.
For someone who doesn't have that economics background, who's not very, friendly with those terminologies, the good thing is it's a very easy flowing read, as you rightly suggested, and more so it generates that interest about understanding your country, because a lot has changed in the last decade or so, and you mentioned some of the challenges that we still face in terms of delivery and governance, but in the past decade or so, there have been transformative policies to this effect. Also, in terms of states' participation, we sort of have moved from cooperative federalism to also another aspect of competitive federalism. How do you see that change having happened and impacting lives of people for the good?
Yeah, see, I think so. One of the biggest areas of success has been kind of using technology, right? For better governance. Okay, so, and in particular, see, I think in the 1980s, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi famously said that for every 1 rupee that the government spends, only about 15 paisa reaches the citizen, right? So, and I think the drive to then do Aadhaar and digital payments and digital direct benefit transfers, a lot of that was motivated by kind of these weaknesses in governance and leakage, right? So, and I think we've made huge progress there, right? So what the DBT allows us to do is allows kind of, leaders to now bypass all of those levels of leakage and get the benefits straight to the beneficiary, right? So that's a huge act of empowerment. So similarly, technology has empowered citizens with much more information, much more choice, so they're much more informed. So all of this is a fantastic thing. I think the next challenge, the next phase where we need to do a lot more work is those services that you cannot disintermediate the human being. Okay, so the human interaction is essential for education, is essential for health, is essential for police, is essential for courts. So you can use technology to improve the productivity and improve the efficiency, but typically you can't substitute the human engagement. And so that requires a much deeper kind of imagining and examining and reimagining of our governance processes, and that's a key part of what the book is trying to contribute to. So it's my headline message of India is like, we're doing really well, but we can do better. So as a professor, my grade for students is always, okay, on one side you say well done, and then the next side is saying, okay, how do we do better?
In one of your interviews that I was listening to, you've spoken about how the goal, the key goal of your book is to compress the cycle of India becoming an effective state from 100 years, which a lot of high-income countries had taken, to about 25 years, which aligns with India's goal of becoming a Viksit Bharat by 2047. And towards this, you've spoken about a number of opportunities, a number of challenges. Let's first take the opportunities. Which are the promising areas? Which are the areas which require heavy lifting?
That's a great question, right? And I think one of the key intellectual reasons for writing the book is that, see, in the last 20 years, there has been such an explosion of high quality research, right? And so the research has given us so much insights about what kind of public programs are effective and what are not, right? So what is the free lunch when I say low hanging fruit? So one way is, most of our development discourse focuses on which sector to increase the budget for, right? Should we increase it for education? Should we increase it for health? Should we increase it for infrastructure, right? But at the end of the day, we have a fixed budget, right? So the main opportunity, the single biggest opportunity that the book is highlighting is to say that we can do better in everything, even without spending more, if we are able to improve the efficiency of our spending and the quality of expenditure. So which is why, one of the endorsements in the book from the former finance secretary highlights that, right? Which is that because all of our discourse is saying which sector will get more money, but if you apply our mind to governance, you can do better in everything. So that, I think, is the most important message, right? So whether it's capital expenditure, whether it's human development, you can do a lot more. And I can give you examples from my research. So let me give you an example again of technology, right? Since we were talking about technology. So technology has a lot of potential, okay, to transform, say, education, but the details really matter, okay? So for example, we have studies showing that personalized education, adaptive software for children can be incredibly effective at improving learning outcomes, because one of the challenges for a teacher in a school today is that children are at very different learning levels, okay? So if I have to teach from the textbook or teach from the curriculum, I'm reaching some students but not reaching other students, okay? But if I'm able to do personalized education software based teaching, then you get big positive effects, okay? So that's the potential of technology. But why do we need the research? Because sometimes, even in the US, there have been these oversimplistic ideas of saying, oh, one laptop per child and laptop will solve all the problems. But what the research shows is simply giving the laptop has no impact, okay? Absolutely. So you then have to apply your mind to say, I'm going to use the technology, but it's not going to help me substitute the teacher, but the teacher has to be empowered to use the technology effectively. So these are then examples of where the research can really help guide policy. See, because most policymakers, they mean well, right? They allocate budgets based on saying, okay, technology should help our children, right? But then if you go look at the data, you'll often see that the technology by itself doesn't kind of translate into impact, and that's where the research really helps. So I think to summarize, I would say what I'm optimistic about and where is the opportunity, where is the free lunch? The free lunch is that we have learned so much in the past 20 years from high quality research about the kinds of spending that are not effective and the kinds of spending that are effective. So if you can move your limited budget from areas that are not effective to areas that are effective, you can do a lot more with the same budget, right? And so that's our opportunity to accelerate growth and development.
Is that where you think the problem lies? Should we begin to have, or is it time that India begins to have more conversations around the outcomes and not just on the mere allocations that the budget has every year for key sectors?
One key lesson in the book, which I talk about, is if you look at global research on effective organizations, okay, what makes effective organizations? In effective organizations, the frontline employee who's close to the problem is given autonomy on how to solve the problem, because you know the problem, but has accountability for outcomes, okay? But one of our key challenges in governance, and this has nothing to do with any government, right? This is a 75-year challenge, right? I mean, it's just a nature of kind of of bureaucracy, is that we micromanage on process, but no accountability for outcomes, okay? So when you say we need to shift the conversation towards outcomes, that's absolutely right? And in fact, I had remember in my consultations with an earlier finance commission, I mentioned that even the money from the government of India that goes to states as part of finance commission or schemes, at least some part of that should be tied to improvements in outcomes. So coming back to autonomy on process, right? one of the challenges is that we sometimes micromanage and micro-specify program details too much, right? But states are now so different in India, that it makes more sense for central allocations to provide more programmatic autonomy to states and even districts on how they will solve their problem, right? So some districts the biggest education problem maybe they have flooding, okay? Others may have other challenges. So you need more autonomy at the local level, but more accountability for outcomes, and which is why one of the foundational investments is better data. And then it is how do you improve your human resources, both your recruitment, your training, your performance measurement, performance management. So none of these ideas are rocket science, okay, because they're all routinely used in the private sector, right? So in any effective private company, so the topics I'm talking about, how do you build an effective state, focuses on things like, so in a private company, what drives the culture of the organization is that what are the outcomes that are being monitored in the quarterly targets, what determines your personnel, your promotion prospects of individuals, and where are the budgets being allocated, right? So it's trying to bring that same lens of accountability and effectiveness into these core aspects of government functioning. So that's what I mean by and so you're right that the focus, the public discourse has to shift from just budget allocation, to impact. But one way to say this is that the government itself is a black box, right? So some money goes on top and some output comes out of the bottom. It's very difficult to do that mapping, but if you improve the effectiveness of our public systems, then you will get more in every sector.
You've done some significant research in the field of education, and one of the studies that I came across, an innovative program in the state of Bihar, that's also my home state, so I'm going to ask you that question about the cycle program, which was implemented with a view to reduce the gender gap in schools. Tell us more about that program, its effectiveness, the kind of impact that it had, and what are the kind of challenges that you also found out which can be placed in the larger context today, which are limiting India's development?
Yeah, it was actually a very simple but I think influential study, because girls' education and dropouts was a huge problem. And now, in fact, other governments like Tamil Nadu had in fact done similar programs, but I think Bihar was more high profile because it was starting off such a low base, what the government in 2005 did was very systematically invest in girls' education. So long story short, part of again, since you have many youngsters and students watching this, there are videos where the methodology of the research is available online. It's called Moving Up a Gear. And the method research method is what's called difference in difference, So you can look at the changes over time. But the bottom line is we find that providing these free cycles to girls in 9th and 10th standard was very effective and significantly reduced the gender gap, and also had, impacts in terms of the fraction of girls who are completing 10th standard. So I think in almost every way, I think that program was a great success, right? I think and to be fair, I think at least at the time when I studied it, even the implementation was very, very good. Okay, so and I think the leakage rates, there was another study that estimated it was only about 2% or 3%, which is very low. And I think part of it was because it was a very high profile program. It was a very high profile program. So if you look at the nature of government programs, what happens is the program that is episodic, because the cycle is given only once, right? And with a lot of attention. So there was not much leakage. But the programs where you have more challenge are the ones that are repeated month after month after month, right? Because then you don't have the same attention on it all the time. Okay, so the cycle program overall was very, very good. I think the challenge is that getting girls to school is only one part of the problem, right? I mean, you still have to solve the problem of quality of education, quality of instruction, and so there I think there's a lot more work to be done, right?
And especially when we are we are pitching for a women-led development approach, something that the Prime Minister has often spoken about. It was one of the themes of discussion during our G20 presidency last year. How would you ensure that such schemes continue in large numbers, not just in selective states, but like overall, and this is something that a larger number of states would adapt for, but education is the foundation. So once you're educated, you're employed, and then you go up to leadership roles.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And see, I think even when we think about women in the labor force, right, I think it's very important to understand that we have such a wide disparity in socioeconomic conditions that what you need is different at different places. Okay, so for highly educated women who are already in the workforce, right, there you need a little bit more work on reducing the glass ceiling for getting to leadership positions. Okay, so there, for example, there is work that says some of the challenges for women, like in kind of say corporate corporate situations is that a lot of the socializing and networking will happen after work, right? Like, I mean, and women often have to go back to kind of also be primary caregivers in the household, right? So though the kind of reforms you need to break the glass ceiling for women's representation in leadership roles is often quite different. Whereas if you go to the other end of the spectrum and saying that how do you get women working out of the house in the first place, right? Need to work. So given that our female labor force participation is very low, and I think there it's important to take baby steps, right? Like, I mean, so often, so for example, I'll give you some examples of some very highly successful interventions, right? So government of Tamil Nadu, okay, after COVID, right, they did this incredible program of COVID learning loss remediation called Illam Thedi Kalvi, which literally means education at your doorstep. So this was a program under which they hired 2 lakh young women who were typically hired kind of to do 60 to 90 minutes of after school makeup instruction. Okay, this was roughly 4:30 to 6 p.m. And the thing is, like, you know, it was a job paid a modest stipend of just about 1,000 rupees a month. Okay, but even at 1,000 rupees a month, there were 4 applicants for every job. Okay, and that's because for a lot of women who cannot even leave the house, this became a way to kind of get empowerment to leave the house, to get respect in the community, and to have some income. Okay, and what our study finds, which just got published recently, was that this was an incredibly effective program. So it was enormously effective at kind of reducing the learning loss after COVID, and so it was efficient, it was cost efficient, it improved equity, and it improved women's empowerment, right? So this was an example of something that is homegrown innovation in India, and you know what the value of the research then is, that these are then ideas that can be replicated in other places as well.
Is it part of the Teen Deviyan program that you've spoken about also in your book?
There, what I'm talking about is, see, we have a much deeper problem with regard to state capacity and service delivery. Okay, so one of the key challenges for governance in India is that we actually have among the fewest number of employees per capita, okay, relative to most other countries. Okay, but one of the challenges, one of the reasons for that is actually our public employee salaries are much higher, okay, relative to GDP compared to other countries. So your basic problem is that you pay too much and you hire too few. Okay, so which means that you need more staff and you need kind of to augment state capacity in more fiscally feasible ways. Okay, so that's one problem. The second problem is, if you look at the data on skilling, okay, which is a central challenge for jobs. Okay, what we see, so let me say one more thing. Okay, one of the questions I often get asked about the future of jobs is that in a world of automation and AI, like, you know, where is the future of jobs? Okay, where are the jobs going to come from? Okay, and I think one critical point to recognize is that the sectors where the jobs will be the safest are the service sector jobs that require human interaction. Okay, so you can't get the AI to kind of replace, you know, like, I mean, whether it's the teacher, whether it's the health worker, whether it's kind of the, you know, local police official. So now again, the technology can make them more productive, but you will still need that human interface. Okay, so part of the idea, and we can, you know, this is, I can spend an entire episode just talking about this, right? But a key idea here is to say, let's improve the quality of our skilling in these sectors by kind of having practicum based skilling programs, whereby, you know, today what happens is a lot of the skilling is just theoretical knowledge, and then what the research shows is that the best knowledge comes when you intersperse theory and practice. Okay, so the idea of that program is to say, let's have these practicum based skilling programs for young women, like, I mean, who are kind of hired from the village. You get a certain amount of training, and then you get your practical kind of appointment in your own village, right, where you are a teaching assistant supporting kind of regular instruction, or you're a nursing assistant, or you can even be a community public safety worker, right? So there are ways in which you can improve skilling and also improve the capacity of the state to have a little bit more kind of augmented frontline capacity. Because, so I'll give you an example from my own personal experience, right? So my son, when he was 4 in the US, in his preschool, like, you know, would have you know, class size of 25. There was one teacher, but there were 3 teaching assistants. Okay, so which meant that these assistants were all working under the supervision of the teacher, but they were able to break the class into small groups of 6 to give more individualized attention. Okay, so today, if you look at the reality in many of our schools, right, one of our challenges is that because we have a lot of small schools, that your typical school will often have 30 to 50 children and have 2 teachers, so then you have multi-grade teaching, where simultaneously 2 teachers are trying to teach 5 classes. Okay, now ideally for high quality education, you want 1 teacher teaching 1 class. Okay, but we can't afford to put 5 regular teachers, right? And so you have multi-grade teaching. Now, what the practicum based apprenticeship program would do is to say you are getting your teacher training credential, but while doing that you're also working as a teaching assistant and you're augmenting the state capacity for small group instruction. So it's a way of improving skilling, it's a way of improving state capacity, it's a way of improving female labor force participation, because one of the biggest barriers to female labor force participation, particularly in rural North India, is that even when you're educated, through a combination of safety and patriarchy, it becomes very difficult to leave the village, right? And so finding employment opportunities within the village, and this is true even in Tamil Nadu, right? That when you can get a chance to be productively contribute, in your village, then you will see women are able to just really make the most of that opportunity. So we have to be realistic, right? So there's a whole continuing scale, and I think it was Prime Minister Manmohan Singh who once famously said that India simultaneously lives in the 19th century, 20th century and 21st century, right? So what you need is to kind of, for every part of where people are, to find ways to make them better off.
I also came across one of your citations wherein you talk about the reforms in the Indian education system, and I was particularly amazed by how simply you've put out the problem that persists even today, and that is about the fundamental source of tension within the education system, which serves two purposes. The first purpose is to seek and impart knowledge skills, which is referred to as the human development aspect of education. The other purpose is to assess and classify students on the basis of their ability and achievements in higher education. And this is what you've called sorting, terming it as a filtration system. Using this framework, what has been your evaluation? What is being done, or in fact needs to be done, to shift from this sorting paradigm to a human development paradigm? We've seen the new education policy bring about, or at least talk about, some of these changes, but on a larger scale, what is the need of the hour to shift from this kind of paradigm to a human development paradigm?
This is a fundamental challenge for education systems globally, right? Which is that if you look at the rise of mass education systems, right, starting in about the 19th century, is that the challenge is that education systems serve three very different purposes, in fact, right? So one is a human development function, which is to teach knowledge and teach skills, okay? There is a second, which you were alluding to, which is kind of the sorting function, which is to kind of rank students and saying, okay, who is kind of high ability and will therefore go to positions, higher education and positions of leadership, right? So that is the sorting and ranking. And then there is a third function historically, which has been about the creation of identity and citizenship itself, which is also something that has been emphasized. Now, the challenge for the Indian system, right, is that historically, unlike say China or East Asia, a lot of East Asian countries prioritize primary education, okay, whereas India started by prioritizing technical tertiary education. Now, there was a logic for that, okay. The logic for the founders was to say that we need a technically educated workforce to be able to absorb better technologies, okay. So one simple example of this is that if I need to build a bridge, I cannot replace one civil engineer with 35 primary school graduates, okay. So I still need that engineer, okay. So the logic therefore of saying we need this tertiary technically educated manpower was to say we need that for development, okay. Now at one level that was correct, but what we neglected was that the much larger numbers of people, need universal primary education. So, which means that we are still kind of looking at the long term, the structure of our early choices in education still shape our economy today, okay, which is we do very well in high skill intensive exports, we do well in software, we do well in skill intensive manufacturing, we do well in pharma, right, but where we don't do as well is in low skill labor intensive manufacturing, right, so whether it's textiles or shoes or the sectors that, can create a lot of employment. So that's the challenge, right, which is so every strategy has strengths and benefits. And coming back to education, again, see, I think the NEP is a fantastic document, right? It really had some outstanding people, they did excellent consultations. But the problem in India has always been not the quality of the policy, but the quality of the implementation, right? And that's why, again, the core of the book is about state capacity, right? And it's not just me. There's a quote from Dr. Rakesh Mohan, who's on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, one of the architects of the 91 economic reforms, where after 25 years he was reviewing and wrote this essay. He says in 2018 that the way forward for accelerated growth in India is being held back by weak governance in the delivery of essential public goods and services. And so that's what the book is about, saying that we have a lot going for us, but to get to full potential, we really have to pay attention to the effectiveness of governance and the delivery of essential services. And a lot of this action is at the state government and local government, right? So, and that goes back to your point about, the diversity. And a key part of the book is to kind of really get state and local governments to get activated about like in the Ramayana there's this famous episode of Hanuman forgetting his own strength, right? And then you need Jambavan to remind him that you are strong enough, right? So similarly, like I think we need to kind of, our state and local governments often look to Delhi, like saying what should we do, but states in India are bigger than most countries, okay? So like we need more state level thought leadership, state level action leadership, and the book is really about providing a roadmap for how we can activate, remember what I said, distribute agency, okay? So there's this lovely quote in the federalism chapter which I use, which is to say the best way to solve our many problems is to increase the number of problem solvers, okay? And so when the Prime Minister says we all need to work together, we all need to work together creatively applying our mind and saying what can we do, and I hope the book contributes to that
Absolutely,
process.
you're right, and the strength of not just the state government and the local administration needs to be awakened. In that sense, every stakeholder, and the Prime Minister keeps saying that everyone has to work together. It's something that should be every Indian's resolve, that we want India to achieve that status in the next few years, less than 25 years from now, because 2047 is when we will be marking 100 years of our independence, and that is where we want to be, in a state wherein we can boast of inclusive and equitable growth. That is what Dr. Muralidharan has been talking about in this elaborate piece of work. So we've spoken about how some of the past achievements have helped us in the kind of present transformation, but at the same time there are challenges, and as a good professor he keeps highlighting how he gives a B grade but he expects us to improve and go to that A+. So we'll continue to talk about the participation of every stakeholder, particularly of the young India, the students. How can we be part of that Viksit Bharat dream and that resolve by 2047, of which we will be the key players? So we'll get a perspective from Mr. Muralidharan in just a short while from now. We'll slip into a very short break here, and the discussion will continue on what his perspective is about making Viksit Bharat a Jan Andolan. Thanks viewers for staying with us. In the previous segment, we were talking to Mr. Muralidharan about his book, about some of the chapters in which he talks about the need to strengthen state capacity to tackle the challenges in time to ensure that we achieve the goals of Viksit Bharat. In this segment, we are going to talk about another chapter in which he's spoken about the need of public participation towards driving the change that we have envisioned for ourselves. And this requires participation from every stakeholder of the society, including us citizens, you and me. So Mr. Muralidharan, thank you for your time, and thank you for continuing to stay with us to chat about this chapter 18, wherein you've spoken about the role of the state, the citizen and the society. How can individuals and communities participate more actively in accelerating India's growth? And this is outside, of course, of the policy changes towards making India a more inclusive and more equitable state.
Yeah, and I think, and thanks for picking up on that chapter, right? Because there's so much in the books that I rarely get a chance to talk about that last chapter. So, so the structure of the book, right? I mean, it starts by, it's got 4 sections, right? Because it starts by kind of laying out kind of the key challenge of state capacity, and it is actually very sympathetic to the key actors in the government. See, often you have the typical tax-paying citizen, like, we'll say we pay taxes. Why is the government not delivering? Okay, so there's often just a lot of external criticism for the government, saying, you're not able to do this, not able to do this, right? But very few people from the outside actually understand the constraints within which the government is functioning. So let me take this opportunity to kind of take a couple of minutes. And so that's why my chapter 2 and 3, 2 is called The Politician's Predicament and 3 is called The Bureaucracy's Burden. Okay, so and this is partly an exhortation to citizens to read those chapters and get into the shoes of key actors of the government and understand the constraints under which they function. And one simple point, okay, which I make, and this is you could easily spend 10 minutes, but I'll try and do this very quickly in 2 minutes, is that, see, if you look at the evolution of the nature of the nation state itself, okay, over time, that historically the nation state countries used to do very limited roles. They were just doing national defense and law and order, okay. So that's what I call a security state, right? Now, over time, government's scope has expanded to do kind of infrastructure, development, welfare, right? And so one of the challenges for India is that high income countries built a welfare state only after they reached middle income status, whereas India has tried to do a lot more at a much lower level of income and a much lower level of tax to GDP ratio. Okay, so when we say the government should do everything, right, we often compare with other high income countries. Okay, but high income countries have a tax to GDP ratio of 35 to 40%, whereas in India that's only 17 to 18%. Okay, now why is our tax to GDP ratio low? It's because when people are poor, you can't tax them, right, because they can barely survive. And so which means that as countries get richer, as kind of jobs get higher quality, they get more formalized, usually the tax to GDP ratio increases. So there is a very subtle point here. The subtle point here is that when you see poverty, okay, people react and say, oh, the government should do more about poverty. But when the people are poor, the government is also poor, okay, because there is much less tax revenue, okay. And so, and in relative terms, the government is even poorer, okay. And so what that means is, when you think about historically, a lot of these public goods were even provided and monitored by communities themselves. Okay, so we have a long tradition of what is called Shramdan, like, where communities would come together and contribute. Okay, so the first part of the book talks about, let's understand the constraints of the government. Then the core of the book is saying, okay, for the government leaders, based on all of the research, how can we make the government function better? Okay, but then the last two chapters are saying, okay, what can each reader, each of us kind of do to kind of contribute towards this broader goal of building a more effective Indian state that can then contribute to accelerating India's development? Okay, and so what I have there is, I have ideas for different sections, right, whether it's kind of political leaders, whether it's officials in government, whether it's business and entrepreneurs, whether it's academics and think tanks, whether it's media, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's citizens, whether it's students. So there's stuff there for everybody. Okay, and part of this is just my attempt of kind of there are two other points I make there, right, that often a lot of kind of civil society discourse vis-a-vis the government is often kind of antagonistic. Okay, like he's saying government should do this, should do that, right? But the point is that once you understand that it is not an uncaring state, it is an overwhelmed state. Okay, that the state actually is trying to do much more than it has the resources or staffing for, and therefore we need to support and kind of encourage public action to do what it has to do. Now, of course, some of this is also a mindset shift, okay, which is from citizens. And there's two ways of thinking about this, right? So one is, again, a key point in the book I make is that our challenges is that we have inherited the structure of a colonial state, okay, and that colonial state was designed to rule over citizens and not to serve them. Okay, now over years with democracy, we have added a lot more service delivery functions and expectations. Okay, but many aspects of how citizens relate to the state is still that of a colonial state. Okay, and so one simple thing, right, one simple action, okay, that I think every citizen should take, right, is we should stop referring to kind of parties as ruling parties, okay, because you should call them governing parties, right, because ruling parties suggests that somehow that you're a king, okay, that you are ruling. No, you are serving, okay, so you are serving people, and you've been put in place by the people as a representative of the people, as a trustee of the common good, okay, and so even just changing that language to say governing party as opposed to ruling party, right, will subtly send a message, right, that this is not kind of it is not government lording over citizen. Okay, so that's one part about how you change the citizen-state relationship to be one of a citizen rather than a subject. Okay, so that's
how welcoming was it when the Prime Minister referred to himself as the Pradhan Se, when some of the words that had been used over the years in the houses, the members, we would see they would rise and say, "I beg to lay on the table," and that was discontinued.
I think, and you're absolutely right. See, I think the Prime Minister has like a lot of the right instincts, because when he says exactly, like Pradhan Sevak, or kind of, Racecourse Road becoming a local landmark, or Rajpath, or Kartavya Path, right? So these are all kind of markers of saying that this is a government, that the people occupying high ramparts of kind of, Delhi, the high echelons of power, should primarily be thinking of themselves as kind of in service of the people. Okay, so that's kind of something that obviously Prime Minister is leading. But this is also, once you think about this as citizens, see, there's a nice analogy I use. Okay, so if you're a manager in a company and if you have employees, right? So the employees, you can't assume that they're going to do their work, right? They need to be monitored, but they also have to be supported. Okay. So similarly, the government is our employee as citizens, right? Because we pay taxes and that's what funds the government. Okay. So if the government is your employee, what does that mean? It means two things. One, you have to demand accountability, okay, as citizens, okay, for service delivery, but you also cannot expect more than it is capable of delivering. Just like if I expect one employee to do like 3 people's work, it will not work. Okay. So part of the challenge is for citizens to also recognize, once you read the book, you'll recognize that the Indian government is actually dramatically understaffed and already doesn't have the money. So then you kind of say, wait, given this limited resources, the state is not able to deliver, partly because it's an overwhelmed state. Okay. And once you understand that, then you say, okay, how can I support as opposed to how can I demand? So it's a very delicate balance. At one level, you're demanding accountability. At another level, you're supporting because you recognize that you can't demand more than the capacity. Okay. So it's a very delicate balance. Okay.
How big and how strong are these measures in building that trust between the party, between the government and the people, between the government and the society?
Yeah. So, and I think, again, see, this is, I'm not a communications expert or communication scholar to know, like, what the exact impact would be, but my sense is that the language that we use in our common discourse really does have a big impact, right? Because it subconsciously shapes how we imagine the citizen-state relationship, right? So I do think that these kind of, terminology matters. And I think you're absolutely right on trust. I mean, and, I talk about trust both in chapter 1 and chapter 18, like, where in the beginning, I quote across countries. In fact, so in the beginning, I'm quoting from a former US Secretary of State, like, who lived to be 100, and he was one of the most kind of distinguished US public officials. And he said, the biggest lesson in my career is that the single most important thing was trust, right? So he said, when there was trust in the room, good things happened. When there was no trust, it didn't happen. Everything else is details, okay? And I think when we think about some of our most complex policy reforms, okay, so let's think about farm sector reforms, farm subsidy reforms, okay? These are difficult problems, okay? Because and I discuss in the middle about how kind of the structure of our farm electricity subsidies, for example, is completely counterproductive. Okay, so it made sense in the 1960s when we had a national food crisis. Okay, but today these policies are both kind of contribute to inequity and inefficiency. Okay, so we need reforms. But part of the challenge with the reforms, as we saw with, like, say, farm sector reforms, is that it is not just about getting the technical side right. You also have to build the trust. Okay, so one good example is how we did GST. Okay, so GST was a very difficult reform. Okay, but there was a process whereby there was a technical committee that laid out a roadmap, and then there was a political process of creating a committee that had state finance ministers, often chaired by a member of an opposition state, because that way you build trust by saying that, okay, we are the government in power, but that this will be led by somebody in the opposition. And then issues were taken one by one by one. And I think Jaitley ji was, especially critical in terms of building that trust across parties. And then we passed a constitutional amendment and we guaranteed states, right? Like, for 6 years. So that was a way of building trust. Okay. So similarly, like when you think about some of our most complex reforms that we need to do, we have to think about, you have to get the economics right, you have to get the politics right, you have to get the trust right. And these are complex processes, but that's what a democracy is all about. Like, that we consult, we build consensus, and then we move forward. Okay. So, and again, I think Prime Minister instinctively gets this, right? Which is why Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas was then augmented with Sabka Vishwas, right? And then coming back to the role of everybody to contribute, you get Sabka Prayas, okay? So, which then again speaks to the importance of that, okay? So, I think, again, that lays out a vision. Now, the challenge is, like, how do different actors kind of then play their respective roles in that? Now, I think on trust, I think one of the things, again, I talk about is the centrality of the decentralization agenda, okay, to a lot of state government effectiveness, okay. And that's because, see, if the biggest problem for service delivery in education or health is that the teacher is not there or the doctor is not there, that cannot be solved from Delhi. That cannot be solved even from a state capital, right? That requires kind of local accountability for that problem, right? So what the research on government trust also shows is that when you reduce the distance between citizen and the government, then that automatically builds trust, right? Whereas right now, often in many cases, the government is too far away. Okay, so there are many ideas in the book for how one can actually build trust, right? And then the last part is the prayas, okay, which is then how do you all contribute to this in our own ways? And we can talk about specific ideas I have on that.
Certainly, and that's something that I would be, interested in talking to you about. Time and again, we've seen how the Prime Minister reasserts on public participation. He leads by example. Swachh Bharat Abhiyan was one campaign that saw massive success because of public participation. And he's saying that unless and until you become a stakeholder, this development is not possible. So you feel important, you feel part of that change, and that's where the role of every individual, of every group will come into play. You've spoken about specific groups, you've spoken about what the civil society going forward should be doing when we talk about the kind of change.
Even when it comes to community participation, right? The most important way in which communities participate in service delivery is by actively being part of their school management committees, actively being part of their local swasthya committees, right? And so you are not expecting somebody sitting far away in a state capital to solve that problem, right? You're saying this is my community. So let's give a simple example of learning outcomes, okay? So we are saying that learning outcomes are a challenge, right? But it is very difficult at a CM level. They can mean to go and say, are the children learning? But if the parents kind of saying, this is my community and I'm going to step in, then there is a lot more, for them to do. And yeah, so I think, there are ideas there for everybody. There are ideas, I think, for business in particular, is to kind of think about, just entrepreneurial creative solutions to a lot of our problems. There's, lots of problems, lots of ideas. For students, I think, one of the things I talk about is for any economic student, for example, right? Analyzing your state budget, right? Taking the principles in chapter 6 on public finance and the quality of expenditure and saying, let's analyze the budget, let's understand, so I think one of the key rules of thumb for citizens say, what power do we have? So I think there's this famous story that 80% of success in life is just showing up. Okay, so you first educate yourself and then be engaged, and educated engagement automatically creates empowerment. Okay, so I think the most low-hanging fruit for citizen engagement is actually with local government, right? Because local government is where service delivery needs to happen, and there are very good templates from organizations like Janagraha, who are civil society organizations focused on urban governance, right? Who have ideas for how citizens can contribute, and yeah, I think there's a very broad range of what can be done.
Your book encompasses 25 years of the hard work that you've put in, the research and the findings, and specifically for this book, you've invested about 5 years. The question here is, what is the kind of change that you wish to inspire among those who are reading your book, and particularly because we are dealing with a lot of youngsters, as I keep saying. So that young population, how do you wish to inspire them through your work?
Yeah, and again, it sounds a little presumptuous, like, I mean, the book is there and then, the people will decide. But I think the goal, like I said, I think at the very beginning, is that I started writing the book as an academic expert who was synthesizing research and saying, here are some solutions. But I think over time, the real impact will come from just giving students a more nuanced understanding, right? About the reality in which they are. So one of the examples I use is that, see, there is this old saying in politics, okay, that's saying you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. Okay, so which is when you're in opposition, you have grandiose claims about ye karenge, wo karenge, right? Then you come into the government and you realize there's a limited budget and you're saying, how am I going to do this? Okay, so similarly, a lot of students when they are young, right? I mean, there's a lot of idealism, and students often protest a lot, right? I mean, and if you look at the data on protests around the world, that often they will get jaded because they have a sense of what they're protesting against, but they don't know how they will actually fix the problem. Okay, and so what I kind of say here is the goal is to empower students to augment the poetry of protest with the prose of policy, okay, so that you actually put yourselves in the shoes of the decision maker and saying, okay, what would you do differently if you had that same budget constraints? So, and this is, I think, a broader advice for most civil society. You see, I think most kind of advocacy organizations who are trying to get the government to do stuff look at their narrow slice, right? I mean, but kind of don't get a sense of how much overall pressure the government is under, right? I mean, so if you were to look at the budgets and saying, okay, where is the inefficiency? What would I cut? Okay, so and I quote like a former finance secretary who said, everybody has ideas for what they want to spend on. Nobody tells me what to cut. Okay, so part of a responsible public discourse is to say, if you want the government to do more of something, then actually provide concrete ideas on what you should do less of. And if you want the government to do something where there isn't money, then what can you do to contribute yourself? Okay, so I'll give one very simple example. Okay. Where again students can contribute. So we know that our court system has like serious challenges, right? I mean, we have substantial backlog of cases, right? And so people talk about this, right? But I think one of the points in chapter 14 on courts and justice is that there is so much that we can do with better data and better analysis, right? Just by kind of looking at the nature of court cases, where are we getting the maximum number of disputes? Is it because there is lack of clarity in the way the law is written? So, and then that data and analysis gives you ideas on how to rewrite the law so that the law is less unclear, okay? So the point is that nobody might be doing this, but there's nothing that prevents any student in any law college, like, from saying we are going to start getting data on kind of court cases. And so documenting, so when you want to do jobs, okay? There's a beautiful PhD thesis by a recent graduate of Berkeley, and she documents that how every district court judge that you appoint is able to clear another 200 cases a year, and because 70% of these cases are credit and land, okay? So these are two of the most critical factors of production, and so when you unlock, because when the court cases means you're not able to productively use them, so basically improving the judicial efficiency substantially improved economic activity, okay? So now that's not a connection we make, but any student in economics, any student in law should be starting to analyze these things and saying, just present the data and saying, here is some data to guide, okay, better policy. So, you can contribute through analysis, you can contribute through kind of engagement with local government issues, you can contribute with, entrepreneurship and innovation when you see problems. So there is a lot to do. And so I think my closing advice to youngsters in particular is, I think when you're young, we often kind of motivate saying, I want to be this, okay? So instead of motivating yourself by saying, I want to be this, think about what you want to do rather than what you want to be, okay? And that means you think like a problem solver of identifying problems and then saying, okay, how are we going to move forward?
Certainly, that's a very important message, and especially for the young population that our country boasts of. Another question, Mr. Muralidharan, the fact that in several ways your book addresses different sections of the society. I'd be interested in knowing about the response that you've had from policymakers, and what are some of the suggestions in this extensive work that you've made, which you would see translate into some kind of policy.
Yeah, no, so it's very early days, okay, because I think the book came out in late March, and then everybody was focused on elections for 3 months, and then I think it's only early July that I have now really started kind of disseminating, okay? So and generally what I do is,
but in that aspect it's quite timely, because the government is still working on the roadmap towards Viksit Bharat.
Right. So that timing worked out well. I mean that I think when the country was focused on elections, I think a bunch of serious policymakers have already read the book and engaged with it. And so now I've been traveling. I've just started. I was in UP, I was in Lucknow last week, I was in Bangalore 2 weeks before that. So I was in Calcutta. So just giving lectures at major academic institutes, and then also engaging with policymakers. So in general, I think the response has been very, very positive, and I think the honest truth is that what the book does is it provides a whole menu of ideas, okay, so that different change makers in different states can then come back and saying, okay, this makes sense in my setting. And so it goes back to this point about distributing agency rather than distributing solutions. So I think the response has been good, but the honest truth is I think we're just getting started. I think we're just getting started in the sense that this is at least a 25-year project, okay, because if you look, high income countries took 100 years to build an effective state. So building an effective state is not something that happens overnight, right? So I think the other point I keep making is that the nature of governance and politics is that you're always focusing more on what is urgent rather than important, okay, because the time cycle is short, okay? So you need to then kind of have spaces that let you think about what is important, and this is going to be a longer term project. So the other thing I'm very, very positive about is that I've also set up a non-profit organization called CGIS, which is the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States. And the whole idea is that, it was built around the same time that I started writing the book. So the idea is to then have a team that is able to support governments that want to implement some of these ideas. And so we've now kind of been working in 4 or 5 different states. And in fact, tomorrow is the 5th anniversary, of CGIS. So I think, the other way youngsters can join, contribute is even by joining, organizations like CGIS and just, doing real work in moving forward on this journey.
What is the kind of talent that you're looking among the youngsters, because a lot of the youngsters are watching us as we speak on the various aspects, particularly about the CGIS. If anybody is interested in joining, what are the kind of talent or skill that you're looking for?
Yeah, so again, you see, I am, there's a full-time CEO who's a former IAS officer who understands government, and so there's a standard process that goes. See, I'm the founder and scientific director, right? So essentially as an academic, my role is more in terms of ideas and kind of building the broader public awareness of how important this is, okay? So, but yes, we're looking for all kinds of talent, analytical skills, project management skills, but, a lot of this is just about So I think the first thing to do is just read the book, right? I mean, so if you read the book and understand it inside out, that'll already give you a huge leg up in terms of applying to CGIS and working with us.
Absolutely. One last question before I let you go. It has received tremendous response, a lot of positive aspects to look forward to, and we would hope that a lot of recommendations that you've made, we will see them translate into policy outcomes in the times to come. But are there any other, research works or books that perhaps you're working on, or the ideas that you're exploring and you would want our viewers to know about?
Yeah, I think, the truth is that this is a synthesis of 25 years of work, and so it's not like I'm going to write another book anytime soon. But I think what I am going to spend a fair bit of time on is finding ways to kind of make it easier for people to absorb the material. So I think in particular, so there are two or three things I'm very keen on getting done in the coming year, right? So the first is translation, right? I mean, so I really care about at least getting this out in Hindi, and ideally even more kind of major languages. I think the challenge is the size of the book, is kind of scaring some of the commercial publishers, but my hope is that we will get the Hindi में कम से कम हिंदी में इसका अनुवाद करके क्योंकि मैं मतलब बहुत गहरी तरह से मानता हूँ कि हमारी पॉलिसी डिस्कोर्स जो है ज़्यादातर अंग्रेज़ी में होती है, और अंग्रेज़ी मतलब बहुत ही फिर भी थिन लेयर एक्सेस करती है. तो अगर इस किताब के मेन मैसेजेस को लोगों तक पहुंचाना है तो लोगों की भाषा में होनी चाहिए. तो दैट आई थिंक इज़ वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. द वन काइंड ऑफ थिंग आई एम स्ट्रगलिंग विथ इज देयर आर टू ऑप्शंस. वन इज पीपल आर सेइंग आई शुड फर्स्ट abridge the book and then translate, but that will take a lot of time. So I think that's one project which I'm kind of grappling with and saying इसको कैसे सबसे efficient तौर से किया जाए. तो वो एक important project है. And the other one is to kind of planning to make slides to make it easy to teach. So for faculty members, my hope is that you will, I really hope that it's written in a way for every college student, not just in economics, right? It's almost like a book that any college student in any subject, should engage with. And like you said, so maybe this is what I'll say, right? You say it has gotten a lot of positive reaction. That's true. But the positive reaction has come, I would say, from people who already have kind of great understanding of governance, right? So the people who've been reading it are among the senior most officials in the government. I had, wonderful So in fact, the president of Singapore, has read the book and sent me a commendation. Very, very senior people in government have read it. I've spent extensive time now with multiple chief ministers. But I think my real long-term goal is really for every Indian citizen, and ideally at least every Indian college student, right, need to read the book. Now for that, I think the most important transmission mechanism is through faculty members. And so my hope is that at least faculty members in economics, political science, public policy, sociology, a whole bunch of fields will engage with the book. And what I'm planning to do is to kind of create teaching materials, case studies, slides, so that ideally you can then use the material in the book for the students to get aware of the concepts and then create kind of case studies in your own context, right? So how can you create a project whereby students in your class will analyze a state budget and think about, okay, if they had to do something differently, what would they do differently, right? So get again people thinking in the problem solver mindset, right? So what I do want to do is perhaps invest time in creating slides and materials to make it easy for faculty members to teach. So those I think would be some of my key next projects over the coming year.
And we hope you're successful with that, because translated copies in Hindi, in other regional languages will not just ensure wider outreach, but will get the message across to a larger audience, particularly within the country. Thank you, Mr. Muralidharan, for speaking to us and explaining to us, having this comprehensive conversation with us about the state that India is in currently, the interesting phase of transformation that we're all witnessing, but the fact that there is a lot more that we can do, the work on which has already begun, but of course we have to tackle those challenges in time to ensure that we are able to achieve the goals of development, see the fruits of development in the next 25 years or so. It's been a pleasure having you on this podcast on Sansad TV. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure too.
संसद टीवी के और भी प्रोग्राम्स देखने के लिए सब्सक्राइब करें हमारा YouTube चैनल और हाँ, इन्हें लाइक और शेयर करना ना भूलें।